episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people. As a little background to today's show, a food desert is an area that has limited access to affordable and nutritious food, and the designation considers both the type and quality of the food that are available, as well as the accessibility of the food through the size and the proximity to different food stores. It was estimated in 2010 by the United States Department of Agriculture that over 23 million Americans lived in food deserts, meaning that lived more than 1 mile from a supermarket in an urban or suburban setting, more than 10 miles from a supermarket in rural areas. Food deserts tend to be inhabited by lower income residents with reduced mobility, makes them less attractive for large supermarket chains, and often the food that is available is highly processed, high in sugars, fats, which are obviously known contributors to obesity, other chronic diseases, and the number of contribution of food deserts into healthcare across the United States is around $70 billion annually. Top Box Foods is a nonprofit, community-based social business with a very innovative model of getting healthy, affordable grocery boxes to food insecure neighborhoods, creating year-round access to fruits, vegetables, and proteins in communities in Chicago and Lake County, Illinois, as well as in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we're honored today to be joined by Mr. Christopher Kennedy, who, along with his wife, Sheila Kennedy, is a co-founder of Top Box Foods. In addition to Top Box, Mr. Kennedy is the chairman of the board of trustees for the Joseph P. Kennedy Enterprises, treasurer of Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, serves on the public boards of Interface and Knoll Companies, and is a trustee for the Marine Biological Laboratory at the University of Chicago. Mr. Kennedy earned his bachelor's at Boston College, his MBA from Kellogg Graduate School at Northwestern. He serves on their global advisory board as well. He's also served as the chair of the board of trustees for the University of Illinois, president of Merchandise Mart Properties, a commercial property management firm in Chicago. And if you're wondering, he is one of the children of Ethel Kennedy and the late Senator Robert Kennedy. Chris Kennedy, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the introduction. I point out that very few people will introduce me as Ethel Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy's son. Usually they say Bobby and then Ethel. And I appreciate you putting my mother first. So
I had an Aunt Ethel, so it's a name near and dear to me.
And I have 30 cousins who have an Aunt Ethel. So Absolutely. We have that in common.
That's wonderful. Chris, typically, I just love to start off. Obviously, your family has a very long history of service, of philanthropy. How did this issue land on your radar initially, and what led you to set up Top Box to begin with?
The short answer is I volunteered at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, which emerged as the country's largest food bank, and continues to occupy that role. It was started here in Chicago. I became chairman of the board, and we doubled the size of the food bank, expanded it dramatically, brought fresh fruits and vegetables in and pre-made food. But it really wasn't enough. The soup kitchens and pantries that the food banks distribute through are often overwhelmed by the demand. And the idea behind Top Box is really to get as many people, what we call out of the line as possible, so that we decrease the pressure on local soup kitchens and pantries. Top Box is really aimed at let's say the working poor, people who can afford something, but we try to double their purchasing power by allowing them to buy food from Top Box at about half the price of a major grocery store chain. And the idea was really founded from experience in the anti-hunger world and the recognition that there's enormous demand, and that demand is often invisible, but it's there.
I was looking, before our talk, I was looking at sort of the top 10 food deserts in the United States. I'm sitting here in Philadelphia, which is not on the list, but right across the river here in New Jersey is the city of Camden, which is on the list. There is one supermarket in all of Camden for 75,000 residents. So obviously a bit of a problem, but supermarkets in this problem are not only part of the issue. There's all, issues with regard to transport, the profit margins, this concept of a food swamp where there's a disproportionate amount of sort of the fast food and the cheaper convenience stores related to grocery stores. Talk a little bit about how we have gotten here as a country in 2021 with all these food deserts across from coast to coast.
Well, I think the specific examples that you've laid out are really important to understand. Why does Camden suffer and large parts of Philadelphia do not? I'm here in Chicago, and there are entire counties in Illinois without a grocery store. I mean, that's incredible. In a state that is maybe the second largest producer of agricultural products in the United States, and yet we have this great divide between our ability to feed the world and our inability to feed our fellow citizens. There's just enormous detachment from the political organization of our country and the outcomes that we're seeing. Specifically, if you're in a large city with a passionate mayor, the mayor can often say to the grocery stores, okay, if you want one in the really nice neighborhood, you have to put one in a place that's maybe less advantaged to you economically. And they twist some arms. And I think that's a little bit of an appropriate role for government to play. But that role has really diminished because the people who live in food deserts often don't vote. And there's an ugly truth. If you don't vote, the government doesn't worry about you. And we've turned our backs collectively, but through our political leadership, on the poor in the United States. And the hunger issue is just one example. But to tell you the truth, you go to a food desert, you'll find lots of other issues as well. It's not just a lack of food. The quality of the housing is poor. The quality of the education is poor. The quality of the public transportation is poor. The quality of the water is probably poor. The air quality is probably much more polluted than it would be in a wealthy neighborhood or suburb. And I think what I'm saying is that these are all part of a larger problem, which is really a political problem and a lack of will and a lack of respect for the dignity of everybody, every individual. And instead, we measure people's dignity by how frequently they vote and how much money they can give to an elected politician. And that is a bad outcome for our country.
Take us a little bit, if you would, through the model, whether we're talking about the Chicago organization or New Orleans. You sell for close to half of retail. You have purchasing purchasing power concepts. Talk a little bit about sort of the neighborhood partners, the importance of volunteers, and a little bit of sort of the corporate sponsors as well, if you would. Sure.
It may be helpful to kind of explain the social business model.
Great, please.
And as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, I'm the eighth of the 11 children that my parents, Ethel and Bobby Kennedy, had. And my oldest brother, Joe Kennedy, who was a United States congressman, then his son was a congressman. But I'm talking about the father, my older brother, Joe. Joe, before he went to Congress, he started a not-for-profit oil company. And that's a, hard term to wrap your head around, but in fact, it was a good idea and worked incredibly well. He would buy oil, and then he would take the oil to a refinery. He would refine the oil and sell off the gasoline, the Vaseline, the jet fuel, and maybe 25 other byproducts of the refinery process. Okay. He would sell those at a profit. He'd use that profit to pay for the home heating oil, which was left over. And then he would distribute the home heating oil to poor people across Massachusetts. Eventually, that company, Citizens Energy, expanded to 28 states and then replicated that model in some other areas like healthcare and other kinds of energy. I loved what he was doing. I was in high school at the time and then college. And I thought, wow, what an incredible way to use the power of the free market the ideas of the best ideas of capitalism, but to use them in service to the community and really to serve poor people. And I loved what he was doing, and I wanted to do the same thing. But I am from a large family, and I don't know whether you can understand this if you're not from a large family, but I am from a large family, and I knew just as clearly that I wanted to go into this field. That I also knew I did not want to work for my oldest brother, not at that time. So I looked around and decided to get involved in the food, the anti-hunger world. And that was sparked a little bit because I was at Boston College, where I went to undergrad, and they have one of the great Irish history departments in the United States. And my great grandparents came because of the famine in Ireland. It's a famous story, and of course, all of us were aware of it. But if you get into the details of the famine, it turned out that the potato crop failed. And potatoes you can grow vertically. So you can grow them, then you can put dirt on top, add a layer, put dirt on top, add a layer, and you mound potatoes. And that's an interesting fact, because what was happening in Ireland is someone would be a tenant farmer and they would divide the land, let's say, between their two children. Then each of the kids that have 2 children or 4 children, they divide the land again. And the plots got smaller and smaller. And the potato became the crop of choice, because even in a small little plot of land, you could build vertically. And potato became a staple for the folks in Ireland who were at the lowest rung of the economic ladder. That crop failed. But there were other crops in Ireland. In fact, Ireland was well able to feed everybody who was there at the time. The challenge came from the fact that most of those other crops were used for export and sent to England. So we had a situation where the island of Ireland could feed itself, but didn't. Millions of people starved to death. Millions of people leave the country in order to survive. So how does that happen? Well, there was economic issues, there were political issues, social issues, religious issues, bias, prejudice between the Protestants, who really controlled a lot of those export crops, and then the Catholics, who were dependent on the potato for their food source. In any case, they failed to overcome those challenges and to feed the people that I think they should have been responsible for. In the United States now, we feed the world, but people are starving. It's the exact same issue. It isn't as prominent, and people don't starve to death and die frequently in the United States, but they're malnutritious. They're malnutritious because of a lack of access to healthy and affordable food. And maybe they're not dying like they did in Ireland, but we have childhood type 2 diabetes, which is out of control in the urban core of most cities. We're amputating teenagers' limbs because they're obese, because the food sources, the calories that they can afford, are packed with sugar and fat and other things that are super unhealthy, pure carbohydrate diets. And the challenges that existed 150 years ago in Ireland exist in America today. And the example of my brother Joe's work at Citizens Energy, and the example of that really torturous time in history in Ireland, the 1840s, 1860s, I don't know, combined to propel me into the anti-hunger world. And then I moved to, I didn't know anything about how food is made or manufactured in the United States, and I ended up moving to Illinois, to Decatur, Illinois, to work for Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, the food processor, so I could better understand how food is grown, distributed, manufactured, and sold throughout the United States. And that really helped, let's say, set a good foundation for my understanding of how the food banks can work and how organizations like Topbox can be successful while helping a lot of people.
And how have Once again, I notice around here that it's not the supermarkets that are in the food business anymore. I can go into Target and Walmart. I can even go to IKEA now. How have sort of some of these trends with these big box stores that may have other profit centers than just food retailing helped or hurt the situation? And then the second part of that, obviously, we've mentioned that you're in the Chicago area, New Orleans. Any city expansion plans beyond those
Sure.
two poles?
I mean, one issue with the major chains is that they're major chains.
Right.
And the grocery stores used to be controlled and owned by families that lived in places like Philadelphia or Chicago or Boston or Washington. They were locals. They were part of the community, active in the Chamber of Commerce, probably knew the mayor personally, had a love of their community, were involved in whatever faith that they were involved in, and they had insight and concern about the community that they were part of. Today, the people making the decisions about where to locate grocery stores in the Chicago area are probably as equally likely to be in, I don't know, Holland as they are in the United States. The folks who are deciding where that Target should go, don't live in that city.
Right.
And they're really looking at demographic information, and the demographic information is incredibly powerful now. I can look up any address, and I use this all the time for Top Box. I can look up any address and see within different spheres, a mile, 3 mile, 5 miles, how many people live there and how much money they make in income. So the federal government takes your tax data and they load it in this database. And now you can see, not you individually, but you can see in the town of, let's say Philadelphia, that there are 800,000 people there and they made $2 billion last year, whatever the numbers are. But more importantly, you can see block by block, mile by mile, where wealthy people live. And the thing about wealthy people is they have more disposable income. They're not spending all their money on life's necessities. And because they have disposable income, they can pay more. It's a higher margin customer. And those big chain stores are locating their stores near wealthy people. I live on the North Shore of Chicago, and for a while, there was the local supermarket chain, the Jewel supermarkets, Whole Foods, and Trader Joe's, all within a block of each other. Like you could park in any one parking lot and go to all three. But that's like crazy, because you go a couple of miles south into the city of Chicago and there's not a grocery store in that Rogers Park area. And it's baffling that we allow that to occur, oversaturation in one market and undersaturation, lack of access everywhere else. And that's a real challenge that comes from these incredibly aggressive corporate mergers and acquisitions, where consolidation is, probably the most powerful economic force in the last 50 years, where there are just fewer and fewer organizations controlling more and more of the economy. And that is not good for communities and neighborhoods. I can tell you that much. The other thing that's challenging is that the high margin product in a grocery store is almost always the grab and go, the pre-made food. And the pre-made food is almost always processed and bad for you. Now, it's not 100% of the time. There are healthy alternatives, but man, oh man, you got to dig hard to find it. Usually it's really bad and really tasty stuff. A carrot cake with an inch of, frosting in a little plastic thing. You go in there, you're hungry, you grab that. So they make more money on it, and they push it. They put it at eye level. They make it more accessible. They put it at the end caps of the grocery stores. Everything they can do to push the high margin, low cost, high carbohydrate, high sugar content, high fat content foods. And that's making America very sick. I hope the grocery store business ever watch this. But it's true.
Yeah, no, I see it right at the corner here. Yeah, no, I'm on the same page. Absolutely. Um, you know, so because here in Philadelphia, I was looking at some recent data. We have about a little over 42,000 vacant lots in the city, representing about 3,000 acres. And occasionally, some local organizations will give urban agriculture a go. Um, I'm in Philadelphia. It gets kind of cold here during the winter months. You're in Chicago. It gets slightly colder there. But for several months out of the year, stuff does grow here. Any interesting uh, urban agriculture sort of synergies with the top box model that you envision, maybe in the warmer climates?
Sure. So when we were young, my father was a large supporter of Cesar Chavez, who organized the folks who were working in migrant farm communities out in California, really around folks who concentrated in picking grapes, and they unionized, and there was an enormous fight between them and the people who controlled the orchards, like the large wine companies, the Gallos and others. But we ended up with a lifelong relationship with Caesar and the folks in that movement. And we all spent a lot of time in the Central Valley. You go to the Central Valley and the size of the farms, I mean, it's as far as you can see for as long as the day goes on.
Yep.
It's such a powerful force that it's really hard to imagine that you can replicate that in an urban setting, particularly in a colder, less hospitable climate. But there are a lot of advantages to urban agriculture that are not solely focused around feeding more people. And those advantages are really important because they change the culture. They get people thinking about what should I eat. And the truth is, once you've had a tomato that you've grown, it tastes so much better than any tomato you've ever bought. Like, the food's just better. Broccoli out of your garden, lettuce out of your garden, eggplants, any of that. When we have our little family, maintains gardens, and we love that. I'd also say the flip side of it is the most expensive tomato I've ever eaten was the one I grew myself. Because, I mean, but by the time, I got like a landscape company to come up, and tear out the sod. Then I had to put up a little fence. Then I had to replace the fence because the bunnies were getting underneath it. And then, I went away for like 10 days and then everything died. So the next year I put in like a little irrigation system, with the hose, and the hose got eaten by some thing. I had to replace the hose. I mean, it's just endless. Yeah. Then I see what somebody else does and I want to match what they've done. They got the nice grate for the tomatoes, and they have the staking system, and I go to a hardware store and I like buy a ton of stakes. And anyways, it's expensive, but it's good for you. And if you can afford it, and if you can work with others, it's a fantastic way to teach your family and your community about the importance of being thoughtful and intentional about what we should consume.
Obviously, the pandemic has impacted everything in our society the last year. Obviously, it's messed with retail quite a bit. Have there been any, I don't say silver linings, but as we're now all getting used to having stuff delivered, any positive silver linings to the top box model in some of these locations?
The great silver lining was the enormous desire for people to help others during the pandemic. And in some ways, weirdly, as we became isolated, we thought more about others, I guess, and not just the desire to be with them, but to serve. And we ended up with, hundreds, if not thousands, of new volunteers who were willing to pick up boxes at a central location and then hand deliver them to a household or a project or, an apartment building. And, you'd see a lot of parts of the city that you wouldn't ordinarily see. When in the beginning, we asked people to come to a congregate location, a place where people could congregate. And we usually work through churches and community organizations. We'd roll up there with a truck filled with food, and then people would meet us there, and they would take the food home that they had pre-ordered or bought that day. Because of COVID, we really couldn't bring people together anymore. It was unsafe for them. It was dangerous to the community, and it was challenging for our volunteers. And we took a little bit of a gamble. We got a donor stepped up just out of the blue and sent us money. There were folks from Pennsylvania, the Barbies, and they gave us money to experiment with a new model. And that new model allowed us to expand the operations of our warehouse. And then we got volunteers to come to the warehouse directly, and they would fill their cars with, let's say, enough food for 5 or 6 home deliveries. And then they would go that morning and do 6 deliveries, probably take them 2.5 hours. And we found thousands of people willing to do that. And that's really the great part of the pandemic. The bad part of the pandemic is awful. And, you know, if you read the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, major publications around what's happening with the economy, they basically describe the economy in 2 or 3 ways. They originally thought of the economy as and its future being V-shaped. Mm-hmm. So there would be a steep decline. We'd hit rock bottom, and there'd be a steep increase in the expansion of the economy such that it would rapidly return to its pre-COVID state. Then there was an idea that maybe it was going to be U-shaped. We might sit along the bottom a little longer and then start to look towards a recovery. Then some people talked about a hockey stick recovery where we ride along the bottom for a long period and then start to inch our way up after significant time had passed. The current thinking is really of a completely different sort. Maybe language that we've never used to describe the future of economic expansion, and that's a K-shaped recovery. Mm. And in that sense, starting, you know, at the vertical line of the K, you have one economy that actually continued to rise, where the stock market increased and wealthy people, frankly, got wealthier. And I mean, I know my house, I live in the suburbs, my home value's gone up incredibly. And if you had a home and you had wealth and stock market assets, you're probably wealthier today than at the beginning of COVID. If you didn't have those things, you have the other branch of the K. And that branch of the K, the leg of it, just goes down. And that's really the economic future for way too many Americans, where we have a radically divided outcome for rich and poor. And I can't think of a recession, honestly, that only affected the poor. And now we're losing solidarity. And that solidarity, that feeling like we're all in this together, that's at risk. And if we lose that, we lose the ties that bind us together as a society and a culture. And that should be legitimately scary to all of us.
A very important message. Chris, there's a couple of areas that I want to ask you about separate from Top Box, and because they're very interesting themes. We talk about them a lot on the show, and love to get your input on these. One of these has to do with the topic of aging. And we talk a lot about the themes of healthy aging, the major demographic shifts that are going on, not just in the United States, but all over the world in terms of the 60-plus population, the so-called silver tsunami that's coming. At the Joe Kennedy Foundation, you're very focused on a particular segment of this, and that is persons with intellectual disabilities, which is also a population that is increasing significantly. We talk a lot about the theme on the show of aging in place. This concept that my 80-plus-year-old mother and father-in-law over here, they don't want to be in an elderly age home. They want to age comfortably at home with new technologies and so forth. Talk about some of the trends, what you're looking at in particular to this particular segment, and some of the programs that you're involved in at the Kennedy Foundation with regard to it.
Sure. I mean, let's maybe begin by talking about, what it costs to get old and to care for somebody, in place, and maybe somebody with profound challenges. That is about what it costs to take care of somebody who's aging in place but has severe challenges and disabilities. If you end up needing round-the-clock care, that is, somebody on the first shift from 8 to 4, then somebody from 4 to midnight, then midnight to 8, and you pay them, I don't know, $20, $25 an hour. If you're going to try to get somebody with higher level skills to deal with higher level challenges, that's going to cost about $250,000 a year. Mm. And no one has an extra $250,000 a year lying. I mean, maybe there's a handful of Americans that do, but that's the real cost of really high-end care at home. And that's just ridiculous. It's not sustainable, and it's not available for most people. The problem is that a lot of people are now living a lot longer, and they're surviving challenges that maybe they wouldn't have survived, pneumonia or other diseases. And they're going to be faced with those costs, more particularly their families are going to be faced with the costs. The subset that's really challenging is people with intellectual disabilities who have been facing those challenges all their lives, but probably receive the vast majority of their care from family members, their parents, their mother and father in particular, usually the mom. And in all likelihood, now the parents will predecease their special needs child, their family member. And that's a different scenario than we were facing 50 and 60 years ago. And for parents who realize that that's coming, that they will be gone before their child's care needs have ended, there's nothing more terrifying to them than thinking about that future. And we don't have a great safety net in place or services in place. The Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, which is focused on helping folks with intellectual disabilities, has made great strides in a number of areas, particularly around educating key members of the Senate and the House, and tweaking language that makes care more readily available, and so that that population isn't unrepresented while laws are being made. And we have outsized impact because of that access to those elected officials and the ability to insert ourselves when language is being considered, let's say during markups. But that's not enough. And the country needs to deal with, the issue of how do we care for our aging population, whether they have disabilities or not. In a lot of states, we've made great progress in terms of allowing family members to be paid care workers. Mm-hmm. And that's a fantastic system. It should be expanded. There should be fewer regulations, and we should embrace the notion that as a government, as a society, we will reimburse or pay family members to care for their elderly relations. That isn't always a popular notion, but it's a super effective social program. And people come back and say, well, why should we pay somebody to do what they're supposed to do anyways? And the truth is, in part, because we get a really good deal. Mm. we get a great deal. They're going to take less than they might in the open market. They're going to provide longer hours that they're not billing for. They're going to have a deeper level of interest and compassion for the those who they are caring for, and largely they'll be available 24/7, and we can reach them whenever we want because they're in the room next door. And there are simple and easy things that we can do to improve people's lives, and yet we don't, and that is perplexing.
Yeah, this model of interfamily care, I've seen a lot about it recently, and it's one of those things that makes you, why haven't we been doing this all along? But yeah, it's very important, that story there. Chris, so one other area I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, the Kennedy family has a very long history with a connection to the water, the seas. You are on the board of trustees at the Marine Biological Laboratory at University of Chicago. For those that are watching that are unfamiliar, I suggest they reach out and take a look at MBL and all the fascinating stuff that goes on there. Talk a little bit about it. Yeah, I mean, your particular interest in sort of the marine sciences, if you would, because there's quite a bit from the microbiome to, I just did a show actually a couple days ago on secrets of invisibility with squids. A lot of neat stuff going on there. Talk a little bit, if you would, a couple minutes about your passion there.
You know, the squid issue is really interesting because there's a lot of, we do a lot of work for the Department of Defense around designing cloaking devices, whether that's camouflage or let's say active camouflage that can adopt to the surrounding and changing landscape. So that's an interesting part of it. But the real core value is this. For maybe the last 100 years, there are probably 95% of all pre-human experimentation for drugs and treatments are done on maybe 7 different species of animals. And, you know, you get rats and mice and monkeys and others, but it's 7. And those 7 don't have the diversity that the rest of the millions of species that live on this earth with us have. And if we expand the range of species that we can learn from, then we can make much greater progress in terms of fighting cancer and every disease that's known. A lot of the species in the ocean are really interesting because, like in a jellyfish or, you know, a small minnow, you can see into the head. You can see into the brain, into the central nervous system. And that makes, let's say, putting a needle in easier to do, but that's a very primitive way to look at it. What it really allows is for scientists to monitor in real time a living specimen that they didn't have to kill to experiment on. Mm-hmm. And by expanding the number of species that we're dealing with, and by creating at Woods Hole a place where biologists from around the world can come and spend a month or 2 during the summer or a week and collaborate. So different teams working on different concepts will book in at the same time. And then they may be from Peru and Russia and Italy and France, and they'll meet there, and there's dorms and housing and species and incredible labs, and they can work collaboratively, and they can learn about new species that the team will bring to their attention. So they'll come into an orientation, they'll discuss what they're looking at, and they'll meet with the wranglers. That's what they call the folks and they'll say, well, have you ever thought about using this species or that species? Let me show you what we have. And they go down, there's an incredible facility on site where we keep and maintain, you know, lots of different species of marine animals and fish, and it's really incredible that almost everybody who wins the Nobel prize in those fields related to biology almost always have gone to Woods Hole in their early career or in their late career to be a part of that worldwide community and the incredible knowledge that's being developed every day in that place. There's a lot of work that Nipam Patel, who runs it now, the lead scientist at the MBL, his specialty is around regeneration. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of species that regenerate. Yep. Humans are not one of them. Mm-hmm. But it's because we turned off a gene in our evolution. The regeneration is chaos in a biological sense. And it's hard to control. And it leads to diseases and developments of abnormalities like cancer. And by shutting off our regenerative power, 1 million years ago or whatever it was, mm-hmm. we isolated and insulated ourselves from the ravishing effect of that chaos and the diseases like cancer that it generally produces. That allowed us to live long lives. We outlive, just about every species. But we now know how to turn genes on and off. Mm-hmm. And it may be that by studying certain species like the axolotl, we can learn how to regenerate and create our own repair system for organ failure or loss of digits or maybe entire systems. And that's really exciting work. And it's maybe over the horizon, but you can see the tip of the mast, and we're getting closer. And to be a part of something like that is incredibly special. And I don't know, it's a gift for me, and people may not realize it's there, but it is, and it's an incredible place.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And we spend a lot of time on the terrestrial side of things, but we don't think of how much we haven't explored underneath the majority of this earth was underwater. So yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. Chris, any final messages to the audience? Are you going to be at any conferences or giving any speeches anywhere, or anything that's non-confidential that's coming up that you want to talk about?
I'd say that one of the great things that I think is going on right now is my sister Carrie Kennedy, okay, has been pioneering a national conference every year for the last decade or so around social impact investing, and she has trillions of dollars are now represented at the conference that she produces. It's called the Compass Conference, and much of it is available online. But to hear people talk about their experiences and the solutions that they've derived to balance the needs of great investment results while protecting our Earth and creating an economy that works for everyone and not just the wealthiest few, it's really invigorating because the wealthiest people are at the conference, and there's a lot of will to change. And I think as they become more comfortable, you'll see the country move in that direction. And if you want to learn more, you can Google Compass Conference at the RFK Human Rights Center.
Outstanding.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful talking to you, Chris. You've taken us from hunger to aging to regeneration and back. Wishing you the best with everything moving forward. For all those listening on the podcast or that are going to be watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Mr. Christopher Kennedy, co-founder of Top Box Foods, chairman of the board of trustees of the Joseph P. Kennedy Enterprises, treasurer of Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, and trustee at the Marine Biological Laboratory, University of Chicago. Chris, thank you for taking the time today. Thanks for everything you're doing. And as we say on the show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us. Do what you're doing. It's really very impressive.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.